Imagine this. A poor delivery driver walks into a billionaire's mansion for a simple package drop-off, and spots a photo of his wife on the desk. She's young, maybe 16, smiling like she belongs there. 1 second, his life is normal. The next? Everything he thought he knew about the woman sleeping beside him is a lie. What you're about to hear actually happened. And by the end, your jaw will be on the floor. Stay with me, because the twist halfway through? You won't see it coming. Harris Gormley was 32 years old, and until that Tuesday afternoon in late November 2024, he thought he knew everything about his wife. He worked as a delivery driver for a logistics company, pulling in about $45,000 a year. Not much, but enough for their modest apartment in Queens, and the life they'd built together over 6 years of marriage. Maria, his wife, worked as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm. They weren't rich, but they were happy. Or so he believed. The mansion on Long Island's Gold Coast wasn't his usual delivery route. Harris had picked up an overflow shift, covering for a sick colleague who normally handled the premium residential areas. When he pulled his truck through the iron gates of the Ashford estate, he felt like he'd driven into another world. The main house sprawled across what had to be at least 15,000 square feet of stone and glass, overlooking the Sound. Old money. Real money. The kind that made his monthly rent look like pocket change. Victor Ashford, the tech billionaire who owned the estate, had ordered a collection of rare books, $12,000 worth, according to the invoice Harris had glanced at. He rang the bell, shifted the heavy package in his arms, and waited. A housekeeper answered, directing him through a marble foyer into a study where Mr. Ashford would sign for the delivery. That's when Harris's entire world shattered. The photo sat in an ornate silver frame on the mahogany desk. Not hidden. Not tucked away. Displayed proudly, like it belonged there. Harris recognized the woman immediately, though she looked younger, maybe 16 or 17. But those eyes, that smile, the small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood accident, those were unmistakable. It was Maria. His wife. In Victor Ashford's private study. Harris's hands went numb. The package slipped an inch before he caught it. The movement jerked him back to the present. His mind raced through possibilities, each worse than the last. An affair? But Maria had never mentioned knowing anyone wealthy. She'd never shown any signs of cheating. They told each other everything. Or so he'd believed, until 30 seconds ago. Victor Ashford entered the study, barely glancing at Harris. The billionaire was in his late 50s, silver-haired, and commanding in the way that came from decades of people doing whatever he wanted. He wore a casual sweater that probably cost more than Harris made in a month. Harris set down the package with shaking hands. He knew he should leave, knew he should stay professional, get the signature, and go. But his eyes kept drifting back to that photograph. Is there a problem? Victor's tone carried an edge of impatience. That photo, Harris heard himself say. The woman in the silver frame. Where did you get it? Victor's expression shifted. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe? Or recognition. That's personal. Why do you ask? Because that's my wife. The words hung in the air between them. Victor stared at Harris for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he moved to his desk, picked up the frame, and studied it as if seeing it for the first time in years. Your wife, Victor repeated slowly. What's her name? Maria. Maria Gormley. She was Maria Rodriguez before we married. Victor set the frame down carefully. I think you should leave. Not until you tell me why you have her photo. I don't owe you any explanations. You're here to deliver a package. Nothing more. Victor pulled out his phone. If you don't leave immediately, I'll call security. Harris wanted to argue, to demand answers, but he knew it was useless. Men like Victor Ashford didn't explain themselves to people like him. He grabbed the delivery tablet, got Victor's quick signature, and left. But as he drove back toward the city, his mind wouldn't stop spinning. How did Victor Ashford know Maria? When had that photo been taken? The frame looked expensive, antique even. The kind of thing you'd use for someone important to you. Not a casual acquaintance. Not a former employee. Maria was working late when Harris got home that evening. He sat in their small living room, the television playing to an empty room, and tried to piece together a puzzle he didn't understand. Maria had always been somewhat mysterious about her past. She'd been adopted at 17 after spending most of her childhood in foster care. Her adoptive parents, the Rodriguezes, were good people who'd passed away in a car accident 4 years ago. Maria rarely talked about her time before the adoption. She'd always said it was too painful, too complicated. Harris had respected that. Everyone had parts of their past they didn't want to look at too closely. But now that silence felt different. Suspicious. When Maria finally came home around 9 p.m., Harris was still sitting in the same spot, his delivery uniform still on. She kissed the top of his head, tired but smiling. "Long day?" she asked, heading to the kitchen. "You could say that." Harris followed her. "Maria, do you know a man named Victor Ashford?" She washed her face carefully, looking for a tell, a flash of recognition, guilt, anything. But Maria just looked confused as she poured a glass of water. "Victor Ashford? The tech guy? I mean, I know who he is from the news, but I don't know him personally." "Why?" She seemed genuinely puzzled. Harris wanted to believe her, but he'd seen that photo. "I delivered a package to his house today. He had a photograph of you on his desk." Maria's glass stopped halfway to her lips. "What? That doesn't make any sense." "That's what I thought. But it was definitely you. Younger, maybe 16 or 17, but unmistakably you." "That's impossible. I've never even met the man." But something shifted in her expression. Not guilt. Confusion. Maybe even worry. "Are you sure it was me? The scar above your eyebrow. Your eyes. I'd know you anywhere, Maria." She set down the glass and pulled out her phone. After a few moments of searching, she showed him the screen. A recent photo of Victor Ashford at some charity gala. "This is him?" Harris nodded. Maria stared at the photo for a long moment. "I've never seen him before in my life," she said quietly. "I swear to you, Harris. I don't know why he'd have my picture." Harris wanted to believe her. In 6 years of marriage, Maria had never given him reason to doubt her. But the evidence was right there. Unexplained and unsettling. Over the next week, Harris couldn't let it go. He started paying attention to things he'd previously overlooked. Maria's phone habits. Her schedule. The occasional expensive item that appeared in their apartment. A designer handbag she claimed was a gift from a work colleague. A necklace she said she'd found at a thrift store. He'd never questioned these things before. Now they felt like red flags. He hated himself for the suspicion. Hated the way he caught himself checking her phone when she was in the shower, scrolling through messages he had no right to read. But he found nothing incriminating. Just normal conversations with coworkers and friends. Nothing about Victor Ashford. Nothing secret or hidden. Then, on a Saturday in early December, everything changed again. Harris was grabbing coffee from their usual spot, a small cafe 3 blocks from their apartment, when he saw them. Maria and a man he didn't recognize sitting at a corner table. They weren't touching, weren't doing anything obviously inappropriate, but there was an intimacy to their conversation that made Harris's stomach drop. The man was well-dressed, expensive suit, polished shoes. He slid a manila envelope across the table to Maria. Harris ducked behind a newspaper rack, his heart pounding. He watched as Maria opened the envelope, pulled out what looked like documents, and read through them. Her hand went to her mouth. She looked shocked. Maybe even scared. The man reached across and squeezed her hand, said something Harris couldn't hear from his hiding spot. Maria nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. Harris left before they could see him. He walked home in a daze, his coffee forgotten. What had he just witnessed? Who was that man? What was in that envelope? When Maria came home 2 hours later, she was quiet, distant. She claimed she'd been shopping, but she had no bags, no purchases to show for her time out. "Everything okay?" Harris asked, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, fine. Just tired." But she wouldn't meet his eyes. That night, Harris lay awake long after Maria had fallen asleep. The pieces didn't fit together, but they formed a picture he didn't want to see. A wealthy billionaire with her photo. Secret meetings with well-dressed men. Expensive gifts with vague explanations. Maria's mysterious past that she never wanted to discuss. Harris had grown up working class in Brooklyn. His parents ran a small dry cleaning business, working 70-hour weeks to keep him fed and in decent schools. He'd learned young that the world wasn't fair, that people like him had to work twice as hard for half as much. But he'd also learned to trust his instincts. And right now, every instinct was screaming that something was wrong. The following Monday, Harris did something he'd never imagined himself capable of. He called in sick to work and drove back out to the Ashford estate. He didn't have a plan exactly, just a desperate need for answers that was eating him alive from the inside. He parked down the street, trying to figure out his next move, when he saw a Mercedes sedan pull through the gates. Through his windshield, Harris could make out the driver. The same well-dressed man from the cafe. The man who'd given Maria that envelope. Harris's hands clenched on the steering wheel. Whatever was happening, it involved Victor Ashford, that mysterious man, and his wife. And Harris was going to find out what it was, even if the truth destroyed him. But as he sat there watching the mansion's gates, Harris had no idea that the truth was far stranger, and more incredible, than any affair or betrayal. He had no idea that the photograph on Victor Ashford's desk held a secret that would change everything he thought he knew about his wife, about family, and about the random chances that shape our lives. 3 days later, Harris's resolve hardened into action. He'd done research, digging into Victor Ashford's background with the obsessive focus of a man trying to save his marriage. Ashford had made his billions in software security in the early 2000s, then diversified into real estate and venture capital. Divorced twice. No children, according to public records. Philanthropist. Political donor. Nothing that explained his connection to Maria. Harris had also tracked the mysterious man from the cafe. It took some work, but he'd followed him from another meeting with Maria. Yes, there had been another meeting Harris had watched from across the street, to a downtown office building. The directory listed him as James Mercer, attorney at law. Not just any attorney. He specialized in estate planning and family law for high-net-worth clients. The pieces still didn't fit into anything that made sense, but they all pointed back to Victor Ashford. Maria had been acting stranger by the day. More distracted. More secretive. She'd started taking calls in the other room, her voice low and urgent. When Harris asked about it, she claimed it was work stress. But Maria had never been a good liar, and Harris could see the weight of whatever secret she was carrying in the tightness around her eyes, the way she startled when he entered a room unexpectedly. On Thursday evening, Harris made a decision. He found Victor Ashford's private office address, not the mansion, but his business headquarters in Manhattan. The next morning, Harris called in sick again and took the train into the city. The building was one of those glass towers in Midtown, all steel and modern art in the lobby. Harris felt out of place in his regular jeans and jacket, surrounded by people in $1,000 suits. But he made it past security with a lie about having a delivery, then found his way to the 42nd floor where Ashford Capital Management occupied half the level. The receptionist, a polished woman in her 30s, smiled professionally. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I need to speak with Mr. Ashford. It's urgent. Personal. I'm afraid Mr. Ashford doesn't take unscheduled meetings. If you'd like to, tell him it's about Maria Rodriguez. Tell him the delivery driver from last month needs 5 minutes of his time." The receptionist's expression flickered. She picked up her phone, spoke quietly for a moment, then looked at Harris with new interest. "Mr. Ashford will see you. But you have 10 minutes. Not 5. Harris was ushered through a maze of glass-walled offices to a corner suite with sweeping views of Central Park. Victor Ashford stood by the window, his back to the door. When he turned, his expression was guarded. Mr. Gormley, I wondered if you'd show up here eventually. You know my name. I know a great many things, Mr. Gormley. Sit. We have matters to discuss. Victor gestured to a leather chair, then settled behind his desk. That same silver-framed photograph sat in the corner, Maria's young face smiling out at them both. You want to know about that picture? I want to know what you're doing with my wife. I'm not doing anything with your wife. Victor's tone was measured, careful. Though I understand why you'd think otherwise, given the circumstances. Then explain the circumstances. Explain why you have her photo. Explain the secret meetings with lawyers. Explain why my wife has been lying to me for weeks. Harris's voice rose despite his efforts to stay calm. Victor studied him for a long moment. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. He slid it across the desk. Before you look at that, I need you to understand something. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible. But it's the truth. And I have the documentation to prove it. Harris opened the folder. Inside were photographs, old ones from what looked like the 1980s or early 90s. A young couple with a small child. The woman had Maria's eyes. The man had her smile. 2 years ago, Victor said quietly, my younger brother and his wife died in a house fire. Their daughter was never found. The authorities assumed she'd perished in the blaze, but no remains were ever recovered. The case went cold. Harris looked up sharply. What are you saying? I'm saying that 2 months ago, I hired a private investigator to take one more look at that cold case. 25 years is a long time, but new forensic techniques, new databases. I wanted closure. What I found instead was evidence that my niece didn't die in that fire. She was taken. The room felt like it was tilting. Harris gripped the edge of the desk. That photo on my desk, Victor continued, was taken 6 months after my brother's death by a security camera at a bus station in Newark. A man was traveling with a girl matching my niece's description. The police at the time couldn't identify them, couldn't track them. But with modern facial recognition software, my investigator was able to trace that girl through various foster care records under different names. She was moved around constantly. Her identity changed multiple times until finally, at age 17, she was adopted by a couple named Rodriguez in Queens. No, Harris whispered. But even as he said it, pieces were falling into place. Maria's mysterious past. Her lack of family. The way she'd always said her early childhood was too painful to remember. I had DNA analysis done, Victor said gently. From Maria's medical records. Nothing invasive or illegal. Just samples from routine blood work that medical labs keep on file. The match is conclusive. Maria Rodriguez, your wife, is Sarah Ashford. My brother's daughter. My niece. Harris couldn't breathe. Does she know? Not yet. I wanted to be absolutely certain before approaching her. I wanted to understand her life. Make sure that revealing this information wouldn't cause more harm than good. Victor's expression softened. I've been having her followed, Mr. Gormley. Not to spy, but to protect her and to understand who she'd become. That's why I know about you, about your marriage, about the life you've built together. The lawyer, Harris managed, James Mercer, is preparing the documentation for when I finally tell her. There's a substantial trust fund. Money her father left behind. Money that's been growing for 25 years. There are properties, investments. None of that matters compared to the truth she deserves to know about her identity. Harris's mind was reeling. Maria wasn't having an affair. She wasn't betraying him. She was caught in the middle of something she didn't even know about yet. A past that had been stolen from her. A family she'd never known she had. Why didn't you just tell her? Harris asked. Because telling someone their entire childhood was a lie, that they were kidnapped and had their identity erased, that they have an uncle they never knew existed, that's not a conversation you rush into. I needed to be sure. I needed to be prepared to support her through whatever came next. Victor's voice carried genuine pain. I lost my brother and his wife. I thought I'd lost Sarah too. Finding out she's alive, that she's been living just a few miles away all this time, it's a miracle and a tragedy all at once. Someone took her, Harris said, the implication sinking in. Someone deliberately separated her from her family. Yes. And I intend to find out who and why. Victor's expression hardened. But first, Maria needs to know the truth. And I think that conversation needs to happen with you there. She'll need you, Mr. Gormley. This is going to turn her world upside down. Harris looked down at the photographs in the folder. A little girl who would grow up to be his wife. A brother who would never see his daughter again. A family destroyed by fire and secrets. His hands were shaking. When? He asked. Tomorrow, if you're willing. James Mercer will be there with all the legal documentation. I have medical records, DNA results, everything she'll need to verify what I'm telling her. Victor paused. I know this isn't what you expected when you came here today. Harris let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. I thought you were having an affair with my wife. I know. I'm sorry for the secrecy, but I had to be certain. 25 years of wondering if she was alive. I couldn't risk being wrong. Victor stood, moved to the window. Your wife is my family, Mr. Gormley. The only family I have left. I'm not trying to take her from you or disrupt your life. I just want the chance to know her. To give her back the truth that was stolen from her. Harris didn't know what to say. The anger and suspicion that had been eating him alive for weeks suddenly had nowhere to go. In their place was an overwhelming sense of the strangeness of life. The random chances and terrible tragedies that shape people's paths without them ever knowing. She's going to need time, Harris said finally. This is going to be a lot. I know. And I'll give her all the time she needs. But she deserves to know who she really is. Who her parents were. What was taken from her. They sat in silence for a moment. Two men bound together by their love for the same woman. One as a husband. One as the uncle she'd never known she had. Harris closed the folder and stood. Tomorrow then. But I want to be the one to tell her you want to meet. She trusts me. This needs to come from me first. Victor nodded. Of course. Whatever makes this easier for her. As Harris left the office, his mind spun with everything he'd learned. He needed to tell Maria. Needed to prepare her for what was coming. But how do you tell someone their entire life was built on a lie? How do you explain that the family she'd lost had actually been stolen from her? The truth was about to shatter everything Maria thought she knew about herself. And Harris would be there to help her pick up the pieces. To stand by her as she discovered who she really was. But neither of them knew that the real story was just beginning. The question of who had taken Sarah Ashford, and why she'd ended up in foster care with a new identity, those answers were still waiting to be uncovered. And when they finally learned the truth, it would reveal a conspiracy that reached far deeper than anyone imagined. Harris drove home in a fog, his mind struggling to process everything Victor Ashford had told him. Sarah Ashford. His wife had been someone else entirely before she became Maria Rodriguez. Kidnapped at age 4. Her identity erased. Her entire childhood stolen. How do you even begin to explain something like that? When he walked into their apartment, Maria was cooking dinner. The normalcy of it, her humming along to music, the smell of garlic and tomatoes, the life they'd built together, felt both precious and fragile. In a few hours, everything would change. Hey you, she said, smiling. How was your day? We need to talk. Harris set his keys down carefully, his hands still trembling slightly. Can you turn off the stove and sit down? The smile faded from Maria's face. Harris, you're scaring me. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. At least, I don't think so. But something's happened, and I need you to listen to everything I have to say before you react. Okay? They sat at their small kitchen table, the same one where they'd eaten 1,000 meals together, where they'd paid bills and made plans and dreamed about their future. Maria's hand found his across the scratched surface. I went to see Victor Ashford today, Harris began. I demanded to know why he had your photograph. Maria's eyes widened. Harris, what? Let me finish, please. He squeezed her hand. He told me something that sounds impossible, but he has proof. DNA evidence. Photographs. Medical records. Maria, your real name is Sarah Ashford. You're his niece. 25 years ago, you were taken from your family after your parents died in a fire. Someone kidnapped you and put you into foster care under a false identity. The color drained from Maria's face. For a long moment, she just stared at him, her mouth slightly open, unable to form words. That's insane, she finally whispered. That's not. I mean, I was in foster care, but that's because my parents abandoned me. That's what they told me. I was found wandering alone when I was 4. No identification. No family looking for me. Because someone made sure no one could find you. They changed your name, moved you between facilities, kept you hidden. Harris pulled out his phone, showed her the photos Victor had given him. This is your father. Victor's brother. This is your mother. Look at them, Maria. Really look. Maria took the phone with shaking hands. She stared at the photograph of the young couple with their small daughter. Tears started streaming down her face before she even realized she was crying. I have dreams sometimes, she said softly. About a woman with dark hair who sang to me. About a house with a big backyard and a tire swing. I always thought they were just fantasies. Things I'd made up because I wanted a family so badly. She looked up at Harris, her face anguished. Are you telling me those memories are real? Victor wants to meet with you tomorrow. He has everything. Documents. DNA results. Your family's history. He wants to give you back the truth about who you are. Maria stood abruptly, pacing the small kitchen. This is crazy. People don't just get kidnapped and have their whole identity erased. That doesn't happen in real life. It happened to you. Harris stood too, reaching for her. I know it's overwhelming, but Maria, you have family. Real family. An uncle who's been looking for you. Who thought you were dead for 25 years. Why? Maria's voice cracked. Why would someone do this? Why would they take me? That's what we need to find out. Will you meet with Victor? Will you at least hear what he has to say? Maria wrapped her arms around herself, looking lost and young. I don't know if I can handle this. What if it's true? What if my whole life has been a lie? Harris pulled her into his arms, feeling her shake against him. Then we deal with it together. The same way we deal with everything. But you deserve to know the truth, Maria. You deserve to know who you really are. The next afternoon, they sat in James Mercer's office, a neutral space that felt less intimidating than Victor's corporate headquarters. The attorney was professional but kind, laying out documents on the conference table with careful precision. Victor sat across from them, his expression a mix of hope and nervousness that made him seem more human than the commanding billionaire Harris had first met. Ms. Rodriguez, or Ms. Ashford if you prefer. I want to start by saying how sorry I am, Victor began. Sorry for your loss. Sorry for the years you spent alone. Sorry for approaching this in a way that may have seemed secretive or frightening. Maria's hand found Harris's under the table, gripping tight. Just tell me what you know. For the next hour, Victor laid it all out. His brother Daniel and sister-in-law Catherine had died on March 15, 1999, when their house in Westchester burned down. Their daughter Sarah, age 4, was presumed dead. But no body was ever found, and the fire investigation had been oddly incomplete. I was living in California at the time, building my company, Victor explained, his voice heavy with old regret. I flew back for the funeral, tried to get answers, but the case went cold within months. I blame myself for not being there. For not pushing harder. James Mercer slid a DNA report across the table. This confirms with 99.9% certainty that you share approximately 25% of your DNA with Mr. Ashford, consistent with an uncle-niece relationship. You are Sarah Ashford. Maria stared at the document, her hands trembling. Who took me? Where have they been all this time? That's what I've spent the last 2 months trying to find out, Victor said. And 3 days ago, my investigator finally found the answer. It's not pleasant. He pulled out another file, this one thicker. Your parents' fire wasn't an accident. Daniel worked as a financial analyst for a private equity firm called Blackstone Ventures. In early 1999, he discovered that the firm's founder, Richard Voss, was running a massive Ponzi scheme. Millions of dollars stolen from investors, most of them retirees who trusted Voss with their life savings. Harris felt Maria tense beside him. My father knew about it. He was going to expose it. He compiled evidence, contacted the SEC, was planning to testify. But before he could, the fire happened. Victor's jaw tightened. Richard Voss's brother-in-law was a fire inspector. The investigation was deliberately botched. And Richard's sister, a woman named Margaret Foster, worked for the state's Child Protective Services. The implications hit Harris like a physical blow. They took her to keep her as leverage. That's my investigator's theory. With Sarah alive somewhere, Daniel's evidence might have seemed less credible. Grief-stricken brother making accusations, unable to even protect his own family. And if Daniel had left any additional documentation, any insurance policy, they'd need Sarah alive to access it. Victor looked at Maria with profound sadness. You weren't killed because you were more valuable alive. A ghost that could be controlled if needed. But they never needed me, Maria whispered. Because my father died before he could expose them. Yes. So you were simply discarded into the foster system under a false name. Moved around every year or two to keep you invisible. Margaret Foster had the connections to make it all work. To bury your real identity so deep that no one would ever find it. Maria stood abruptly and walked to the window, her back to all of them. Harris could see her shoulders shaking. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. I remember being scared. Being in a car with a woman who said my parents were gone. That I needed to be quiet and good or bad things would happen. I remember foster homes. Different names. People telling me to forget who I was before. She turned, tears streaming down her face. I thought I was going crazy. I thought those memories were nightmares. They were real, Victor said gently. All of it was real. And I'm so sorry I didn't find you sooner. Where are they now? Maria's voice turned hard. Richard Voss and Margaret Foster. Where are the people who did this to me? James Mercer cleared his throat. That's complicated. Richard Voss's Ponzi scheme was eventually exposed in 2004, after the statute of limitations on the arson and kidnapping had passed in some areas. He served 8 years in federal prison for securities fraud but was released in 2012. He's been living quietly in Connecticut ever since. Margaret Foster retired from child services in 2008. She's in her 70s now, living in Florida. They got away with it, Maria said flatly. They murdered my parents, kidnapped me, ruined my life, and they got away with it. Not necessarily, Victor said. New evidence, new testimony, new charges can still be filed. Murder has no statute of limitations. And now we have you. Proof that you survived. Proof of what they did. Harris watched his wife's face transform. The shock and grief were still there, but underneath was something harder. Something determined. I want them to pay, Maria said quietly. I want everyone to know what they did. Over the next 2 weeks, Maria threw herself into piecing together her stolen past. Victor opened his home to her, sharing photo albums and videos of her parents. She watched herself as a toddler, heard her father's laugh, saw her mother's smile. Each discovery was both a gift and a wound. Glimpses of a life that had been ripped away. Harris watched her change. The woman he'd known, sweet, gentle Maria, who worked quietly as a bookkeeper and rarely made waves, was discovering a core of steel she'd never known she possessed. This was Sarah Ashford, daughter of a man who tried to do the right thing, even when it cost him everything. Victor had offered her access to the trust fund, nearly $8 million accumulated over 25 years. Maria had looked at the number and felt nothing. Money couldn't buy back her childhood or bring back her parents. But it could fund something else. Justice. I want to hire investigators, she told Victor and Harris one evening in late December. They sat in Victor's study, the same room where Harris had first seen her photograph. I want to find every piece of evidence that connects Voss and Foster to what happened. I want it airtight. The family attorney already has people looking into it, Victor said. But Maria, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that we can't prove everything. It's been 25 years. Evidence degrades. Witnesses die. Memories fade. Then we find what we can and we make it count. Maria's voice was steady. These people took everything from me. They don't get to just live out their retirement in peace. Harris had never been prouder of her, or more worried. Maria, this is going to be hard. Going up against people like that. Reliving everything. I know. But I need to do this, Harris. I need them to know that Sarah Ashford didn't disappear. That they failed to erase me. She took his hand. I need you to understand why this matters. I do understand. And I'm with you. Whatever you need. What they needed, it turned out, was a small miracle. And they got it from an unexpected source. In mid-January, Victor's head investigator, a former FBI agent named Patricia Cole, requested an urgent meeting. She arrived at the apartment with a laptop and an expression Harris couldn't quite read. I found someone, Patricia said without preamble. Someone who worked for Richard Voss in 1999. His name is Dennis Hartley, and he's dying. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Maybe 3 months left. He's decided he wants to clear his conscience before he goes. Maria leaned forward. He knows something. He knows everything. He was Voss's right-hand man. Helped him run the Ponzi scheme. He was there the night they planned the fire. Patricia opened her laptop, turned it so they could see. He's willing to give a formal deposition. He'll testify to everything, the scheme, the murder, the kidnapping. He says he's lived with the guilt for 25 years and he wants to make it right before he dies. Harris felt Maria's hand tighten in his. Why now? She asked. Why come forward after all this time? He has grandchildren. Says he can't die knowing they might someday learn what he did and think he was a monster. He wants to do one decent thing before the end. Patricia's expression softened. I know it's not much of a redemption arc. But his testimony could be the key to everything. Within days, Dennis Hartley gave a videotaped deposition that laid out the entire conspiracy. He described how Richard Voss had panicked when Daniel Ashford discovered the fraud. How they planned to make it look like an accident. How Margaret Foster, Voss's sister, had suggested taking the child instead of killing her. Leverage. Insurance. A way to muddy the waters if Daniel had left behind evidence. We told ourselves we were saving her, Hartley said on the tape, his voice weak and raspy. That she'd have a better life than being orphaned. But the truth is, we were monsters. We took that little girl and threw her into the system like she was garbage. And Sarah's parents, Daniel and Catherine, were good people. They didn't deserve what happened to them. Maria watched the deposition with tears streaming down her face. Beside her, Harris held her hand while Victor sat stone-faced, his jaw tight with rage. That's enough, James Mercer said, pausing the video. We have what we need. With this testimony, we can move forward. Move forward how? Maria asked. Criminal charges against Richard Voss and Margaret Foster for conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, child endangerment, and fraud. The DA will need to review everything, but with Hartley's testimony and the supporting evidence we've gathered, we have a strong case. Maria nodded slowly. I want to be there. When they're arrested, I want them to see my face and know they failed. Patricia Cole smiled grimly. I think that can be arranged. The arrest happened on a cold morning in February. Harris took the day off work to be with Maria when the news broke. They watched from Victor's penthouse as news helicopters circled Margaret Foster's daughter's house in Garden City, where the elderly woman had been staying. Police led her out in handcuffs, her face shocked and pale. In Connecticut, Richard Vasa's arrest was less dramatic but more satisfying. He'd been having breakfast at a country club when federal agents arrived. The news cameras caught him trying to maintain his dignity as he was escorted out past stunned fellow members. Former financial executive and CPS worker arrested in cold case murder and kidnapping. By evening, every major news outlet was covering the story. The case had everything: murder, conspiracy, a child stolen and lost for decades, and finally justice. Maria watched it all with an expression Harris couldn't quite read. Not satisfaction exactly. More like exhaustion mixed with grim determination. "It's not over," she said quietly. "The trial will take months, maybe years. They'll fight it. They'll try to discredit Hartley's testimony, claim the evidence is too old, argue technicalities. Let them fight," Victor said. He joined them at the penthouse, the three of them bound together by blood and purpose. "We have the truth on our side. And we have something they took away 25 years ago. We have Sarah Ashford, alive and ready to face them." That night, Maria couldn't sleep. She and Harris lay in bed in their small Queens apartment. They'd refused to move, despite Victor's offers of better accommodations. This place was theirs. A life they built with their own hands. "Do you ever wonder who I would have been?" Maria asked in the darkness. "If none of this had happened. If I'd grown up as Sarah Ashford with parents who loved me and an uncle who would have spoiled me in a normal, stable childhood." Harris pulled her closer. "I think about it. But I also know that person wouldn't be the woman I fell in love with. You are who you are because of everything you survived. And you're incredible." "I'm angry," Maria admitted. "I'm so angry all the time now. Angry at what they took. Angry at the years I spent thinking I was nobody. That I didn't matter. Angry that my parents died for trying to do the right thing. That's okay. You're allowed to be angry. But I don't want anger to be all I have. I don't want this to consume me." She turned to face him in the dark. "Promise me something, Harris. Promise me that no matter what happens with the trial, no matter how this ends, we don't let it destroy who we are. We don't let them take anything else from us." "I promise," Harris said and meant it. The preliminary hearings began in March. Maria testified, her voice steady as she described her fragmented memories of being taken. The years of confusion in foster care. The identity that had been stolen. She looked directly at Richard Vass and Margaret Foster as she spoke, refusing to let them look away. Dennis Hartley appeared via video link from a hospice facility, his testimony damning and detailed. The defense attorneys tried to discredit him, convicted felon, dying man trying to ease his conscience. No physical evidence to support his claims. But Patricia Cole had been thorough. She'd found the fire inspector's falsified report, traced the money that had changed hands, documented Margaret Foster's unusual involvement in Sarah's case. Piece by piece, the conspiracy was laid bare. In April, Dennis Hartley died. But his deposition remained, a ghost testifying from beyond the grave about sins that could no longer be hidden. The trial was set for June, and Maria Ashford, she'd started using her birth name, though Harris still called her Maria in private, prepared to face the people who destroyed her family and finally, after 25 years, demand they answer for what they'd done. But as spring turned to summer, none of them realized that the trial would reveal one more secret. One final piece of the puzzle that would change everything they thought they knew about that night in 1999. And the real reason Sarah Ashford had been taken. The complete truth was still waiting to be uncovered. And when it finally came to light, it would be stranger and more heartbreaking than any of them had imagined. The trial of Richard Vass and Margaret Foster began on the first Monday in June in a federal courthouse in Manhattan. Harris took a leave of absence from his delivery job. Victor had offered to cover their expenses, and for once, Maria had accepted. This was more important than pride. The courtroom was packed. Maria sat in the front row with Harris on one side and Victor on the other, a united front. Across the aisle, Richard Voss sat with his expensive defense team, looking older than his 73 years but still carrying himself with the arrogance of someone who'd gotten away with everything for decades. Margaret Foster, 76 and frail-looking, sat separately with her own attorney. The two defendants hadn't spoken to each other since their arrests, a crack in their alliance that the prosecution intended to exploit. Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Walsh was sharp and relentless. In her opening statement, she laid out the case methodically. Daniel Ashford's discovery of the Ponzi scheme. His intention to report it. The convenient fire that killed him and his wife. And the daughter who disappeared without a trace. Sarah Ashford didn't die in that fire, Walsh told the jury. She was taken, deliberately, systematically, by people who saw a 4-year-old child not as a human being, but as a loose end to be managed. And for 25 years, they thought they'd gotten away with it. But Sarah Ashford is here today, alive, and ready to tell you what they did to her. The defense's strategy became clear. They'd argue that Dennis Hartley's testimony was unreliable, a dying man's delusions motivated by medication and guilt over unrelated crimes. They'd claim the fire had been a tragic accident. That Sarah's disappearance into foster care was a bureaucratic failure, not a kidnapping. That the connections the prosecution had drawn were circumstantial at best. My client is 73 years old, Richard Voss's attorney argued. He served his time for the securities fraud crimes he deeply regrets, but he is not a murderer. He is not a kidnapper. And the prosecution's case rests entirely on the word of a convicted felon who waited until he was literally on his deathbed to suddenly remember this elaborate conspiracy. But the prosecution had more than Dennis Hartley's testimony. On the third day of trial, Rebecca Walsh called Dr. Michael Gormley, a forensic analyst who'd reviewed the original fire investigation. He testified that the fire's point of origin and burn patterns were consistent with arson, not an electrical fault, as the original report claimed. More damning, he identified 3 significant omissions in the original fire inspector's work. This wasn't incompetence, Dr. Gormley stated. This was deliberate falsification designed to support a predetermined conclusion. The defense tried to argue that mistakes happen, that second-guessing a 25-year-old investigation was unfair. But Walsh was ready. She produced financial records showing a $50,000 deposit into the fire inspector's account 2 weeks after the blaze, money that came from a shell corporation later tied to Richard Voss's network of fraudulent entities. Harris watched Maria's face as the evidence mounted. She sat perfectly still, her expression composed, but he could see the toll it was taking in the tightness around her eyes, the way her hands clenched in her lap. On the 5th day, Maria took the stand. Rebecca Walsh guided her through her testimony gently but thoroughly. Maria described her fragmented memories of that night, being taken by a woman who said her parents were gone. The terror of not understanding what was happening. She spoke about the years in foster care. The constant moves. The feeling of being erased. They told me different stories about where I came from, Maria said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. Sometimes I was abandoned. Sometimes I was found wandering. The details always changed. I grew up thinking I was nobody. That I didn't matter enough for anyone to keep track of my story. And when did you learn the truth? Walsh asked. 4 months ago. When my husband discovered my photograph in my uncle's home. When I learned that I wasn't nobody. I was Sarah Ashford. And I had parents who loved me and an uncle who never stopped looking for me. I learned that I mattered. That I'd always mattered. The defense's cross-examination was brutal. They tried to suggest her memories were false, implanted by suggestion and the desire to believe Victor's story. They pointed out inconsistencies in her recollections. Dates that didn't quite line up. Details that seemed too vague. Isn't it true, Ms. Ashford? Voss's attorney pressed. That you have no actual memory of being taken as you claim? That your earliest clear memories are from age 6 or 7 in foster care? My earliest clear memories are from that age, Maria agreed. But I have fragments from before. Images. Feelings. Moments. And they match what actually happened. They match the truth. Or they match what you've been told happened. What you want to believe happened. Because it gives your difficult childhood a narrative that makes you the victim of a conspiracy rather than the victim of ordinary tragedy. Harris saw Maria's jaw tighten, but her voice remained calm. I am the victim of a conspiracy. The evidence proves that. And nothing you say can change what they did to me. The trial's turning point came in the second week when Margaret Foster's attorney made a calculated move. Seeing the evidence mounting against his client, he approached the prosecution with an offer. Margaret would testify against Richard Voss in exchange for a reduced sentence. The courtroom was electric the day Margaret Foster took the stand. She looked smaller than she had during the arrests, diminished by age and the weight of her crimes. But her memory was sharp, and her testimony was devastating. Richard called me the day after Daniel Ashford contacted the SEC, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He was panicking. He said Daniel had enough evidence to destroy everything. To send him to prison for decades. He asked if there was a way to make it stop. And what did you suggest? Rebecca Walsh asked. Nothing. Not at first. But then Richard's brother-in-law, the fire inspector, he suggested making it look like an accident. And Margaret's voice broke. I said if they went through with it, they needed to be careful about the child. That if she survived, she could be a complication later. What did Mr. Voss say to that? He said to take care of it. To make sure she disappeared but stayed alive in case they needed leverage if Daniel had left evidence behind somewhere. Margaret looked at Maria for the first time, her eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I told myself I was saving you by not letting them kill you too. But I know that's not true. I was just covering for their crime. The courtroom erupted. The judge called for order. Maria sat frozen, staring at the woman who'd stolen her childhood. Who'd thrown her into the system and erased her identity. Under cross-examination, Margaret revealed more details. How she'd personally handled Sarah's case file. Creating a false history. Moving her between facilities to keep her invisible. How she checked on her periodically over the years, always from a distance, making sure she stayed lost in the system. Did you ever consider telling the truth? The prosecutor asked. Every day, Margaret said, her voice breaking. But I was afraid. Afraid of prison. Afraid of what Richard might do to me or my family if I talked. So I stayed quiet. And I let that little girl suffer for my cowardice. The defense tried to salvage something, suggesting Margaret was lying to save herself, that her testimony was self-serving. But the details matched too perfectly with the evidence, with Maria's fragmented memories, with Dennis Hartley's deposition. Richard Voss's face was ashen as Margaret stepped down. His empire of lies was crumbling, and everyone in the courtroom could see it. The prosecution rested after 2 more days of witnesses, financial experts who traced the money, child welfare workers who confirmed the irregularities in Sarah's case, even the Rodriguez's former attorney who testified about how unusual it had been for Maria to have so little documentation when they adopted her. The defense put up a fight, but it was clearly a losing battle. They called character witnesses who spoke of Richard's philanthropy in later years, his regret over the Ponzi scheme. They tried to paint Margaret as the mastermind, suggesting she'd acted independently. But the evidence was overwhelming. And when the defense rested without calling either defendant to testify, the jury's verdict seemed inevitable. Closing arguments took 2 days. The defense argued reasonable doubt, the unreliability of testimonies from criminals in the distant past. The prosecution laid out the timeline with devastating precision. Every piece of evidence. Every connection. Every lie that had sustained the conspiracy for 25 years. Sarah Ashford was 4 years old, Rebecca Walsh told the jury in her final statement. 4 years old when these defendants decided her life was worth less than their freedom. They murdered her parents. They took her from her home. They erased her identity and threw her away. And they went on with their lives thinking they'd gotten away with it. But Sarah Ashford didn't disappear. She survived. She grew up. She built a life despite everything they did to her. And she's here today asking you to hold them accountable for what they took from her. For the parents she'll never know. For the childhood that was stolen. For 25 years of lies. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, Harris held Maria's hand so tightly his fingers went numb. On the count of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, how do you find? Guilty. On the count of kidnapping? Guilty. On the count of child endangerment? Guilty. Every count. Every charge. Guilty. Richard Voss sat motionless as the verdicts were read, his face blank. Margaret Foster wept quietly, her shoulders shaking. Maria didn't react visibly. She just sat there, Harris's hand in hers, and breathed. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Richard Voss received 25 years to life, effectively a death sentence for a 73-year-old man. Margaret Foster, because of her cooperation, received 15 years with the possibility of parole after 10. Given her age and health, either would likely die free. But the story didn't end there. After the sentencing, Victor's investigator Patricia Cole requested one final meeting. They gathered in Victor's study, the same place where Harris had first learned the truth about Maria's identity. "There's something we missed," Patricia said, opening her laptop. "Something that didn't come up in the trial because it wasn't directly relevant to the criminal case. But I think you need to know." She pulled up a photograph, an old picture of Daniel Ashford with another man, both young, both in business suits. Daniel kept a safety deposit box that we only found last week. Inside was documentation of the Ponzi scheme, evidence he'd planned to give to the SEC. But there was also this. She handed Maria a letter, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. Maria's hands shook as she unfolded it. "My dearest Sarah," she read aloud, her voice breaking. "If you're reading this, it means something has happened to your mother and me. It means I wasn't able to protect you the way I should have. But know this. You are loved beyond measure. You are strong, brilliant, and kind. Everything your mother and I dreamed you would be. I've discovered things at work that I cannot ignore. Bad people doing bad things that will hurt many innocent families. I have to stop it, even if it puts us in danger. Your Uncle Victor will take care of you if anything happens to us. He loves you as much as we do. Never forget who you are, Sarah. You are an Ashford. You come from a line of people who stand up for what's right. Even when it's hard. Even when it costs us everything. I hope you never have to read this. But if you do, know that your mother and I will always be with you. Proud of everything you become. All my love forever. Dad." Maria clutched the letter to her chest, sobbing. Victor moved to her side, his own eyes wet. Harris wrapped his arms around her, holding her as 25 years of grief finally poured out. "He knew," Maria whispered. "He knew what might happen, and he did the right thing anyway. He was brave," Victor said quietly. "Just like his daughter." In the weeks that followed, Maria worked with victim services to try to locate other children who might have been similarly lost in the system due to Margaret Foster's corruption. They found 3 cases that raised red flags. Children with incomplete records. Mysterious origins. Families that had been searching for them. The truth had opened doors that had been closed for decades. Maria also started working with Victor's Foundation, using her experience and her trust fund to reform foster care oversight in New York. She testified before the state legislature, sharing her story and pushing for better tracking systems, more accountability, stronger protections for vulnerable children. Harris watched her transform. She was still his Maria, still the woman who hummed while cooking and left notes in his lunch. But she'd also become Sarah Ashford, heir to a legacy of courage and conviction. One evening in early August, they sat on the small balcony of their apartment, watching the sun set over Queens. Maria had been quiet all day, thoughtful. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Marrying a delivery driver's girlfriend instead of a billionaire's niece?" Harris laughed. "I didn't marry a billionaire's niece. I married you. The money, the family drama, the courtroom theatrics, That's all just stuff that happened. You're still the woman who laughed at my terrible jokes and said yes when I proposed with a ring I saved 6 months to buy. That was a good ring, Maria said, smiling. I still wear it. Even though you could afford better now. It's not about the price. It's about what it means. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Thank you for standing by me through all of this. For believing me. For supporting me. For being exactly who I needed when my world fell apart. That's what marriage is, Harris said simply. Being there when things fall apart. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the city lights flicker on as darkness fell. In the distance, Harris could see the skyline of Manhattan, where Victor's penthouse rose among the other towers. Somewhere out there, Richard Voss and Margaret Foster sat in prison cells, paying for their crimes. Somewhere, other families were being reunited with children they thought were lost forever. And here, on this small balcony in Queens, a delivery driver and the woman who'd been nobody and someone all at once had found something that all the money and power in the world couldn't buy. A love built on truth, tested by fire, and strong enough to weather any storm. I've been thinking, Maria said after a while, about having kids. If we started a family, I want to tell them about my parents, about Daniel and Catherine, and how they died trying to do the right thing. I want those kids to know where they come from. I think that's beautiful, Harris said. They'll have an incredible legacy to live up to. And they'll have you to teach them that heroism isn't about money or power. It's about showing up, telling the truth, and loving people even when it's complicated. Maria turned to look at him. You're the hero of this story, Harris. You found that photograph. You pushed for answers. You refused to let it go. You gave me back my family. We gave each other everything that matters, Harris corrected. And we'll keep doing that through whatever comes next. 6 months later, Harris stood in Victor's mansion, now a place he visited regularly, no longer intimidated by the wealth or the setting, and watched Maria give a speech to a room full of philanthropists and child welfare advocates. She spoke about her experience, about the gaps in the system that had allowed her to be lost, about the changes that were already being implemented to protect other children. She was confident, articulate, powerful. The woman who'd once been too scared to speak up at work meetings was now commanding the attention of some of the wealthiest and most influential people in New York. When the speech ended, Victor approached Harris with 2 glasses of champagne. She's remarkable, Victor said, watching Maria network with the crowd. She always was, Harris replied. The world just didn't know it yet. I'm glad she had you. Through all of this, you were her constant. That matters more than anything I could have given her. Harris clinked his glass against Victor's. She would have been fine without me. But I'm glad she didn't have to be. That night, back in their apartment, they decided to stay in Queens despite numerous offers to help them move somewhere more appropriate. Maria kicked off her heels and collapsed on the couch with a sigh. Tired? Harris asked. Exhausted. But good exhausted. She patted the couch beside her. Come here. Harris sat, and she immediately curled into his side the way she always did when she needed comfort or connection, or just the reassurance of his presence. I was thinking today about what you asked me once, Maria said. About who I would have been if none of this had happened. If I'd grown up as Sarah Ashford from the beginning. And I think I would have been happy. Privileged. Maybe a little spoiled. She smiled. But I wouldn't have been as strong. I wouldn't have learned to survive. To rebuild. To find value in myself without any external validation. I wouldn't have met you. You might have met someone better, Harris teased. There is no one better. There's just you. The man who saw me when I was invisible. Who loved me when I was nobody. Who stood by me when I discovered I was somebody's daughter and niece and heir. You didn't care about any of that. You just cared about me. Harris kissed the top of her head. That's all that ever mattered. I learned something through all of this, Maria said softly. Something I want to remember forever. What's that? That justice isn't just about punishment. It's about truth. It's about making sure that people know what happened. That the victims are seen and heard. That the lies don't get to become the official story. My parents died trying to tell the truth. And in the end, the truth won. It took 25 years. But it won. She sat up, looking at him with those eyes that had stared out from a photograph in a billionaire's study and changed both their lives forever. And I learned that family isn't just about blood or shared history. It's about the people who show up. Who stand beside you when everything falls apart. Who believe you even when the truth seems impossible. She took his hand. You're my family, Harris. You always will be. And you're mine, Harris said. Through everything. Forever. They sat together in their small apartment, surrounded by the life they built with their own hands. Outside, the city hummed with millions of other stories, tragedies and triumphs, secrets and revelations. Justice delayed, but never denied. But inside, there was only truth. Only love. Only the quiet certainty that they'd face the worst and come through stronger together. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's becoming more than what those who wronged you ever imagined possible. It's taking what they meant to destroy and turning it into something beautiful. Something true. Something that matters. Sarah Ashford had been taken. Maria Rodriguez had been lost. But the woman who emerged from those ashes was stronger than either name alone. She was herself, fully realized. Finally free. And that was a kind of justice no verdict could ever match.